Welcome to our panel about the EPA's proposed carbon dioxide regulations. Section 111D of the Clean Air Act authorizes the EPA to limit emissions by requiring the, and I quote, best system of emissions reductions, close quote, for given substances. You'll hear the acronym BSER a lot today, and the draft regulations begin with a table of 70 other acronyms that the EPA includes in its proposed regulations. The regulations call on states to come up with requirements that by 2030 will reduce by 30% the carbon dioxide emissions from existing coal-fired power plants compared with the 2005 benchmark. The EPA has specified how much reduction each state has to achieve. The amounts differ. 30% is the national average. The burden is on the state, which may be politically convenient for the EPA, but the state has the option to balk. Though if it does that, the EPA will flesh out the specifics itself, and states may like the result less. Although you read in the press much discussion about carbon capture and sequestration, the proposed rules don't require any plant to do that. Instead, they anticipate that states will choose among 4 kinds of actions. 1, requiring plants to become more efficient so they burn less coal. 2, changing the rules of dispatch so that cleaner plants are used first. And that means natural gas as a practical matter. Dispatch is the order in which plants are drawn on to meet demand. Coal plants usually are high in the dispatch table because they're most efficient when run continually at full capacity. And then other plants that are easier to get going, often gas-fired, are brought online for peak periods. The EPA evidently wants the dispatch position of coal-fired plants reduced at the same time as it wants them to run more efficiently. The third suggestion is replacing coal-fired plants with wind, water, solar, nuclear, or renewable plants that have lower net carbon emissions. And fourth, the EPA suggests making electricity use more efficient. It's easy to see that newer air conditioners and refrigerators at home could do some of that, but the principal changes would have to be in industrial production. Under the draft, states can choose freely among those strategies and others, such as cap-and-trade systems. All that matters to the EPA is hitting the specified reduction. It's not clear to me as an outside observer how all of these options can represent the best system of emissions reductions. The agency seems to have specified an outcome rather than the best system, but the discussion may enlighten us. The EPA estimates that its proposals would cost approximately $5 billion and produce benefits between $48 billion and $82 billion. About 2/3 of those benefits come not from carbon dioxide reductions, but from lower emissions of sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and particulates. And those benefits come simply from less use of coal. Even if we ignore everything other than carbon dioxide, though, the benefit-cost ratio is spectacularly high, which poses the question why the EPA didn't require even greater reductions. But estimates of benefit-cost ratios cannot be taken on faith, no matter what their source, and this too may be a topic for the panel. And it's a star-studded panel. I'll introduce the speakers in the order you'll hear them. After short presentations, we'll have an exchange and then questions from the floor. First is Robert Sussman, currently a principal at Sussman and Associates in DC and an adjunct professor at Georgetown. He was a partner at Latham & Watkins, founding the firm's environmental practice. In 1993 and 94, he was deputy administrator of the EPA, and from 2009 to 2013, he was senior policy counsel to the EPA's administrator. Next, we hear from Paul Bailey, the Senior Vice President for Federal Affairs and Policy of the Coalition for Clean Coal Energy. He's had many other roles in the energy sector, including vice president of the Edison Electric Institute. Robert Percival, our third speaker, is a professor of environmental law at the University of Maryland. He wrote the leading casebook on environmental law and has served on the board of the Environmental Law Institute. The EPA ignores him at its peril. Finally, we will hear from Elbert Lynn, the Solicitor General of West Virginia. Until becoming the state's first Solicitor General, he was a partner at Wiley Rein in DC. I've skipped over the other speakers' academic backgrounds and clerkships. For example, I didn't tell you that Professor Percival clerked for Justice White. But I can't avoid mentioning that Mr. Lynn is the first person I've encountered who has clerked at all three levels of the federal judiciary: for District Judge Robert Keaton in Massachusetts, Circuit Judge William Pryor of the 11th Circuit, and Justice Clarence Thomas. We start with Mr. Sussman.
Good morning to all of you, and Judge Easterbrook. Thank you both for the very nice introduction, and also for the very lucid description of the EPA rule, which I think is going to help frame this discussion. As all of you know, the big climate story this week was the U.S.-China agreement on controlling greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot to be said about this agreement, although not as part of this session, but one thing is very clear. And that is the president is putting the U.S. on a path to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions and believes that existing authorities provide a basis to achieve these reductions. The rulemaking we're discussing today under the Clean Air Act is not the only tool that the administration is using, but it is probably the most significant tool. And after the Beijing announcement, its fate is more important than ever. If this rule ultimately stands and is implemented, the U.S. may be within reach of achieving the reductions to which the president committed in Beijing. But if this rule does not stand, then the path in front of the administration will be very difficult, if not impossible. Because this is the Federalist Society, I'm assuming that many in this room are skeptical about using existing law to address climate change and dubious about the merits of the EPA proposal. So I'd like to emphasize a few big picture points here. First, while the quality of the science for policy making is never perfect, the degree of scientific consensus on climate change is about as good as it gets. There's a high level of agreement that the globe is warming because of the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that this buildup is the result of burning fossil fuels, and that without reversing current emission trends, the growth in emissions will quickly reach a tipping point where significant warming is inevitable by the end of this century. Second, we know that the burning of fossil fuels to produce electricity is the biggest contributor to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. About 33% of U.S. emissions come from fossil fuel power plants, and we also know that coal is the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel. And third, wholly apart from EPA regulations, we're seeing a transformation in our electricity sector that is lowering its carbon footprint, and I want to underscore that. We now have plentiful, low-cost natural gas in the U.S., due largely to hydraulic fracturing, and this has led to a dramatic shift away from coal. We're also seeing renewable energy come into its own, and Americans are using less electricity, so growth in electricity demand in this country is flat and even in some areas declining. So as a result of these trends, after steady increases in U.S. emissions over the last 5 decades, something remarkable has happened, and that is that carbon emissions from power plants in this country declined by 15% from 2005 to 2012. 15%. This occurred without measurable increases in electricity rates. It occurred without blackouts. It occurred without mass unemployment. It's truly a remarkable story. So to come back to the EPA proposal, EPA is designing this proposal to build on the forces that are transforming the power sector with some additional regulatory incentives on top of the market dynamics that are now at work. Judge Easterbrook indicated that the EPA rule by 2030 would achieve a 30% reduction in fossil fuel emissions from power plants. That would basically be another 15% on top of the 15% that has already been achieved, and it would be accomplished over a 15-year period as opposed to the 7-year period in which emissions declined by 15%. So let's take a look at the rule. And as Judge Easterbrook said, the heart of the proposal is the definition of best system of emission reduction, or BSER. And EPA has defined BSER to constitute 4 strategies or building blocks. And Judge Easterbrook listed those for us. And there are questions about what these building blocks really mean and what they call for, and even some questions about whether these are the right building blocks or the only building blocks. But I think on the whole, they track the forces that are already operating in energy market and driving down emissions. So it's very hard to argue, I think, that these building blocks are not demonstrated, they're not achievable, because we have a lot of evidence that indeed they are. I think the main debate here is whether EPA has authority to require reductions that call for action outside the fence line, that is, outside the perimeter around the power plant. And this is an issue, I think, with building blocks 3 and 4. I don't believe it's an issue with building blocks 1 and 2. And I think that EPA has a pretty good case here that indeed it is not confined to requiring improvements in plant technology that are within the plant boundary. And the reason for that is the term system of emission reduction, which I think has a broad meaning and stands in contrast to other provisions of the Clean Air Act, which do zero in on technology requirements. Here, Congress did give EPA a fairly broad scope. So we could debate that issue, but I think EPA has a pretty plausible position. I'm going to stop here. These are all issues that I'm sure we're going to return to in the discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, who I believe is Paul Bailey.
Good morning, everyone. I have a few PowerPoint slides, which will prove that I'm the token policy nerd among these distinguished legal experts here this morning. Let's skip this one. This is a little bit deep here. Don't read that right now, I guess is what I'm saying, in a nice way. Just to put this in perspective, my group represents utilities that burn coal. We represent coal producers. We represent all the major railroads, much of whose revenues are derived from hauling coal, and then some equipment manufacturers. Go back to that. We took the position on 111D that EPA, notwithstanding our legal reservations, the farthest EPA could go would be to set standards, CO2 standards based on measures inside the fence, which would be efficiency improvements at power plants. EPA exceeded our wildest expectations and proposed the 111D rule. So I'd like to go over with you what we regard as some of the economic consequences of the proposal. I will touch very briefly on the benefits or lack thereof, I should say. We hired National Economic Research Associates, who has done work for us in the past to model this proposal. It's a very complicated proposal. I think most of you realize that. I think at one point it was something over 2,000 pages if you count all the documentation that goes along with it. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to do economic modeling of this. We ended up with two scenarios we felt pretty well bookended the effects of the EPA proposal. And that's all that really is. I'm not going to dwell on that. But if you think about it this way, one of the scenarios allows states complete flexibility to meet the emissions rate that EPA set for the state. The other scenario limits the states in selecting those building blocks. And we selected the more limited scenario based on what we think EPA would do in writing a federal implementation plan or in states that are not able to pass legislation necessary to increase renewables or energy efficiency. That's all that really says right there. This puts the cost of this proposal in perspective. The first two green bars, the first one, $7 billion. I apologize to the panel here, you cannot see that. The first green bar, the shortest one, is EPA's estimate of the cost of all clean air rules for the power sector in the year 2010. All clean air rules for the power sector in 2010, $7 billion. The next, I'm sorry, wrong slide. Let's see, let me go back. Apologize, all these slides begin to look alike. The two green bars, my apologies here, the two green bars are roughly what EPA estimated this rule would cost. The judge here mentioned about $5 billion. It's, you know, once you go through all the numbers, it's somewhere $7 or $8 billion a year. NERA projected for us costs somewhere between $41 billion and $73 billion a year. So 41 billion, best case scenario, 73 billion would be the upper end of the cost. The next one is the one I was explaining without benefit of the slide. This just puts the cost in perspective here. The 7 billion the EPA projected for all clean air rules to the power sector in 2010. You see the cost of the mercury and air toxic standards. That's EPA's projection. We also projected the same cost, by the way, 10 billion a year. And then we have the Clean Power Plan proposal at 41.73 billion per year. These are some of the economic effects of the proposal. I've highlighted some of those for you. This almost sounds like we've made these up, but we did not. 43 states would have double-digit electricity price increases. So most of the country faces double-digit electricity price increases over the next decade and beyond. We have 14 states with electricity price increases projected to exceed 20%. We have total compliance costs. That's a present value over a 15-year period. EPA does not project total compliance cost. NER's model does. You see at the low end, that's 366 billion over a 15-year period. Then we have consumers paying somewhere between 34 and 48 billion per year in higher electricity costs and to reduce the use of electricity. That's one of the lessons we learned from all this, is that this is a program to substantially reduce the use of electricity in the United States. Matter of fact, the next one explains that the cost of reducing electricity use in the U.S., in other words, paying for energy efficiency measures, double pane windows, more efficient appliances, things like that, is over $500 billion over a 15-year period. EPA projected cost, as best we can tell, probably about half that amount. So you're paying more to use less electricity there. Then we have additional coal retirements. Right now, the amount of coal capacity, the electricity supply that is announced it will retire, is equivalent to the electricity supply of California right now. Those are the retirements that have been announced so far that we expect. Most of those will happen by the year 2020. That's led to a lot of concerns about maintaining electric reliability. The Southwest Power Pool has talked about rolling blackouts, and I'm quoting them now. And other areas of the country have spoken to that concern also. And then you see the other numbers, coal generation declining, which is consistent with what Judge Easterbrook said here. And then we have natural gas prices not going up a lot. EPA actually projected higher natural gas prices than we did. I'm going to touch very briefly on the benefits here. Bob mentioned the agreement with China. What China has agreed to do is stop increasing emissions by 2030. That's what that agreement really means. This is to put the U.S. power sector in perspective in terms of climate change, if you want to think about it that way. The higher bar are anthropogenic global greenhouse gas emissions. That's close to 50 billion tons right now. Then we have China and India. China is 9 billion of that 11 billion. So China and India together are 11 billion. China is 9 billion of that right now. Then we have the entire U.S. is 6 billion tons. And then we have the electric power sector is a substantial contributor to that 6 billion tons. So it's 10 billion tons. So you can imagine if you decrease that 2 billion tons by a small amount, which is what's happening, you don't get much in the way of benefits. This just shows you what happens to global emissions. This one, pardon the cartoon, this is our communications people, but it still does make a point. These are climate effects based on EPA's analysis for another rulemaking. What you see is that this rule would reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations by less than 1% in the year 2050. You have global average temperature being reduced by less than 0.02 degrees Fahrenheit in the year 2050. You have sea level rise reduced by 0.3 millimeters, which is the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. That is for 41 billion a year. There is substantial pushback on EPA right now. You're familiar with that. I won't go into that in any detail now. Some of you involved in this. Judge, I will stop there and turn it over to the next panelist.
It's a real pleasure to speak to this group. I have enjoyed attending some of the other panels and going to the dinner on Thursday night. Whenever I talk to a Federalist Society audience, though, I always have to make the point that I kind of wish for an organization that's supposedly nonpartisan, that there were a few more panels on why, for the last 36 years, I've had no voting representation in Congress because I moved to DC to clerk for Justice White, and I've been a resident of DC. That's one of the most fundamental injustices from the standpoint of federalism, and it would be nice if the Federalist Society would focus on that a little bit. Both the previous speakers have mentioned the historic agreement that President Obama reached with Chinese President Xi Jinping that was announced on Tuesday. And one of the reactions, the soundbite that you heard from the Republicans was, this doesn't require China to do anything until 2030. That would kind of be like saying the Clean Power Plan, because full compliance is not required until 2030, doesn't require you to do anything in the meantime. I do a lot of work in China. In 2 weeks, I'll be over there for my 4th trip of the year. And I can tell you the Chinese have been doing an awful lot. They now have 7 pilot carbon trading programs in major cities in China. They're going to be going to a nationwide cap and trade system by 2017. You saw Mr. Bailey's slides about Chinese emissions compared to the United States. What he didn't show you was that in per capita terms, the US is emitting about twice the greenhouse gases per capita than China is. In historic terms, all emissions throughout history that are still contributing to the greenhouse effect, the US is emitting about 3 times as much, has emitted about 3 times as much as China. China in absolute terms is the #1 emitter. And that's all the more reason why anything we can do to get the Chinese to reduce their emissions is absolutely vital to the fate of the planet in the future. You heard also about the cost-benefit estimates of EPA, and you heard Mr. Bailey say how this is going to greatly increase electrical prices because it's going to be so expensive. Actually, the Clean Air Act has been by far, in my view at least, the most successful environmental regulatory program as far as producing tremendous net benefits because of all the lives saved by reducing air pollution. And if you look throughout history, at every step of the process, in 1970, when Congress mandated that the automobile manufacturers come up with pollution controls on cars, they said it was impossible, we couldn't do it. Nonetheless, it was mandated and the catalytic converter developed. In 1990, when the Clean Air Act amendments were being debated, it was argued that the Title IV program to reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide, largely from coal-fired power plants, would be enormously expensive. And yet, it ultimately ended up proving to cost only a small fraction of what had been forecast at the time. 20 Nobel Prize-winning economists begged President Bush to veto the 1990 amendments because it was going to destroy our economy. Instead, the result has been that we have clean air that is an envy of all those people in China, and one of the reasons why the Chinese government now realizes that it has to play major catch-up. Now, I'm going to focus a bit on the legal issues. And the first issue that we should just start with is that the legal debate is over with respect to the legality of EPA regulating greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. That was settled by Massachusetts versus EPA, where the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, declared that greenhouse gases were an air pollutant that could be regulated under the Act. Now, many people agree that it probably would have been better for us to design a new comprehensive legislative program, which is what President Obama tried to get Congress to do, and it passed one House, did not pass the Senate at a time when you basically needed 60 votes to get anything done. But barring that, the EPA has done a remarkable job in using the Clean Air Act's existing authority, which was originally intended to provide a comprehensive legal strategy for protecting air pollution to address what now has become a very important problem. Massachusetts versus EPA is here to stay. The conclusion that it reached has been subsequently reaffirmed by the Supreme Court in the American Electric Power case, most recently in June in the Utility Air Regulatory Group case, where only two of the justices, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, called for overruling Massachusetts versus EPA. The other justices rejected that. So we are in a position where it's clear EPA has the authority to use the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Now the question is the legality of the Section 111D rules. First start from the proposition they aren't promulgated yet, even though 4 different sets of lawsuits have been brought trying to stop EPA from doing a rulemaking. One was tossed out. The state of Nebraska's challenge almost immediately. The DC Circuit's shortly going to hear oral argument on another challenge. It's kind of a fundamental principle of administrative law that you can challenge final agency action. The comment period isn't even closed. It will close on December 1st, and EPA has said it anticipates promulgating the final rule in June. Now, one major objection to what EPA is doing focuses on a drafting error that occurred in the 1990 amendments. If any of you remember the process by which those amendments were adopted, it was done very quickly, lots of it behind closed doors. President Bush and the congressional leadership wanted to get comprehensive legislation enacted, so they largely shut out a lot of lobbyists from both industry groups and environmental groups. And it was done so quickly that there's not a whole lot of legislative history. But one error that happened was that 2 different versions of Section 111D were passed in the final legislation, and they conflict with one another. They're both the law of the land in the sense that they're in statutes at large. One would allow EPA, the Senate version, to regulate any air pollutant that's either not a criteria air pollutant, which of course greenhouse gases are not, or a hazardous air pollutant, which of course greenhouse gases are not, so there'd be no question that EPA could regulate them under Section 111D. The House version says that any air pollutant that, in addition to the NAAQS exclusion for criteria air pollutants, it also says that any air pollutant emitted by a source category that is not on the list of source categories regulated by Section 112's hazardous air pollutant provisions could not be regulated, which would essentially mean that because EPA's regulated mercury emissions from power plants, it would not be able to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases from power plants. Now, EPA's position is that this statutory error creates an ambiguity, and that the only reasonable way to read the statute is that the Senate version should be adopted because Congress was trying to expand EPA's regulatory authority, and it wouldn't make any sense to say you can regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but not from coal-fired power plants. There is one important precedent here, and that was the Appalachian Power case that the DC Circuit decided in 2001. A similar drafting error was in the act, which effectively meant that under Section 126, states could not petition EPA to do anything about transboundary air pollution. Only foreign governments could do so. And the DC Circuit there said that EPA has to show that Congress could not have intended this, and it found that EPA has established that the statutory language does not reflect the unambiguous congressional intent, so they read the statute the way it should have been. And I suspect a similar thing would happen here. You may recall the original Chevron decision, Chevron deference, I know there was a panel here where Chuck Cooper was arguing that we should get rid of Chevron, but that original decision involved a case where the Reagan administration wanted to relax regulations by adopting the bubble policy, and Chevron deference suddenly was invented by the Supreme Court. If we continue to apply it, I suspect this is a situation where EPA's interpretation would be upheld. Finally, they mentioned the BSER portion of the regulations. How do you interpret best system of emissions reduction? The principal argument here is that EPA can't regulate beyond the fence. But in fact, EPA is not regulating beyond the fence. What it's doing is regulating utilities and giving them credit with respect to what happens in energy efficiency reductions or states deciding to increase the use of renewables. And there, we've long had that in the Clean Air Act since the offset provisions in 1977. And since the Act does not define system, and the ordinary meaning of system would include focusing on interconnectedness of electrical grids, I suspect that this would be a case much like the EME Homer City case the Supreme Court decided in April, where the court, by a 6-2 vote with both Justice Kennedy and Chief Justice Roberts joining the majority, said the Clean Air Act didn't specify a particular allocation, so EPA's approach was reasonable and we'd be entitled to Chevron deference. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks to the Federal Society for having me here, and to Judge Easterbrook and the other panelists. Let me first apologize for my voice. I'm recovering from a cold. We've got 2 little boys at home, and as far as I can tell, they are disease vectors and serve no other purpose in the world. Also, full disclosure, I am involved in 2 of the multiple allegedly premature lawsuits that have been brought. The state of West Virginia is amicus supporting Murray Energy in a suit in the DC Circuit. And we also have our own 12-state lawsuit. All of those suits have been essentially consolidated for full briefing and oral argument, which will occur this spring. So I want to focus on, in my limited time, what I see as 3 significant legal hurdles to the existing source rule that we're talking about. And I think an important thing to start with is somewhat unusually, EPA issued with their rule a 105-page legal memorandum. That's 105 pages in order to justify what it is that they're doing here. I think the first thing to say is we'll hear a lot in the debate, not just here, but in general, about Massachusetts versus EPA and whether there is authority to regulate greenhouse gases. I think that's a red herring. That's not the question here. The question is, let's assume that they can, right? There are still at least 3 problems. So the first big one is the statute 111D is about existing sources, right? So, and it says in there that it talks about standards for existing sources to which a standard for a new source would apply. And it's relatively undisputed that there is a prerequisite for an existing source rule. There's some debate now about whether it has to be a new source rule or a modified source rule, but the point is, before the existing source rule can be adopted, there has to be a rule regulating new power plants, or as EPA is now saying, modified power plants. And the issue with the new source rule, which came out several months before the existing source rule and should be finalized several months before the existing source rule, is it's the same standard, right? There has to be a best system of emissions reduction as applied to a particular source, in this case, new power plants. And the DC Circuit has said that that system of emissions reduction has to be adequately achieved, or adequately demonstrated, achievable through adequately demonstrated technology. What they're requiring of new power plants is CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, right, which was mentioned earlier today. The difficulty is carbon capture and sequestration has never been demonstrated on a commercial scale. So we think that the first big problem is they're not going to be able to get the new source rule through the courts, We don't think that the technology on which it's based has been adequately demonstrated. And furthermore, there is a law, the Energy Policy Act, that says that when EPA is making these kinds of assessments, they cannot base that on government-funded technological projects. And if you look at the new source rule, the few examples that EPA cites in there, many of them are government-subsidized technological projects. So once you take those away, you're left mostly with small-scale stuff and stuff internationally, and we just don't think that that meets the standard. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is as Professor Percival was talking about, the 112, 111D issue. The place to start there is, I wish I had brought some slides, but here's the one thing that's undisputed. If you look at 111D as it's written in the US Code, it says you cannot promulgate a standard for an existing source that is already regulated under 112. Right? 112 addresses hazardous pollutants, and 111D is what we're talking about here. That is undisputed. In fact, in the 105-page legal memorandum that I was referring to before, EPA admits that under the literal terms of 111D, as it appears in the US Code, they cannot do what they are proposing here. So their response is, well, if you look in the statutes at large, in 1990, there were actually 2 amendments passed. It's a bit of a misnomer, I think, to describe it as 2 versions of 111D have been passed. What happened is there were 2 amendments, right? There was a House amendment and a Senate amendment. They weren't reconciled in conference. Both of them got through. They're separated by 107 pages in the statutes at large. So here's the issue. The first one, so what 111D used to say was you can't promulgate a 111D regulation if for an air pollutant that is listed under 112. The First Amendment substantively changed that, changed it from the reference to, it literally said a list of pollutants in 112, so it's a statutory reference. Took that out and said, or emitted under a source category regulated under 112. The second amendment, the Senate version, the Senate amendment, which is 107 pages later in the statutes at large, is listed as it literally says a conforming amendment. Now, some of you may not have heard what conforming amendments are. If you look at the Senate drafting manual, a conforming amendment is kind of what it sounds like, right? When you make a bunch of amendments substantively to a statute, you got to go back later and clean stuff up, right? If you've renumbered some provisions, if you've taken some out, what do you do with all those cross-references that are no longer accurate? Those are conforming amendments. So there was a conforming amendment in the Senate version that instead of striking the reference to 112, what happened is the 112 provision had been renumbered. And so it essentially renumbers it. Now that has been interpreted by the EPA as saying, okay, you've got one amendment that changes it from the hazardous pollutant list to source categories regulated under 112. And then they say there's another amendment that actually didn't do anything, right? Because it just made the numbering, it just brought the numbering up to date, but it left it as a reference to the 112 hazardous pollutant list. They say this is ambiguous, and then I would beg to differ with Professor Percival on what the EPA's position is. They don't actually say, no, we should instead adopt the Senate version. They say, we're actually just going to make up something new, right? Under one version, it says you can't regulate a source category that's regulated under 112. Under the other version, you can't regulate a hazardous air pollutant that's regulated under 112. They don't pick one or the other. They say, well, there are these 2 things out there. We don't know what to do with them, so we're just going to say you can't regulate a hazardous air pollutant that is emitted from a source category that is regulated under 112. We're going to combine them and make an even narrower restriction than either of them standing alone would do. So our response to that is twofold, which I'll make very quickly. One is we don't actually think there's a conflict, right? If you have a substantive amendment and a conforming amendment, the substantive amendment is executed first. I mean, that's what conforming amendments are all about. You execute your substantive amendments, you make all your changes to the statute, then you go back through and you clean it up and make sure that it doesn't have weird cross-references that go places that don't exist. And here, what you have is, once you execute the substantive amendment, you get to the versions of the US Code. Then you get 107 pages later to the list of conforming amendments, and lo and behold, that actually has been rendered moot because the provision has been taken out. There's nothing to conform. What the note says, a note in the US Code from the person who codifies it, someone who works for Congress, and it says, the Second Amendment, quote, could not be executed. And we have a brief that we filed, and we went through the US Code and we looked, and this has happened dozens and dozens of times. And this is what happens. You run your substantive amendments through, you make all the significant changes that Congress intended to make, and then if you've got a conforming amendment that really wasn't supposed to do anything except for clean the statute up, that's been rendered moot, then it just goes away. The second response is, fine, even if you accept that these two things go together, that you have to give them both meaning, then give them both meaning, right? Don't just throw your hands up and come up with something that's totally new. And so our response would be, you can actually read them both together. You cannot regulate under 111D either A, an air pollutant that is listed under 112, or B, a source category that is listed under 112. That would be the way to give both amendments meaning. The third significant legal problem we think gets to this inside the fence, outside the fence issue. And so what you've heard is, what is the meaning of best system of emissions reduction? And there's two responses to that, and that is one, it says, what the statute says in defining standard of performance is the application of the best system of emission reduction, the application of it. And then at various points in the statute, it talks about applying the best system to a particular source, to an individual source, right? And so the response is, EPA doesn't have the authority to regulate a system, it has the authority to regulate a source. And the source here is a power plant. And the second response, which is similar to that, is the first thing I was talking about, you have to have the new source rule as a prerequisite. Well, the new source rule here is regulating new power plants, and so it would make sense that if that's the prerequisite, then what you'd regulate under the existing source rule is also power plants. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all four panelists. Consistent with Federalist Society tradition, in which we encourage dialogue, we have time for the four members of the panel to respond to each other's presentations. I'll invite them in the order that they spoke previously to take about 2 minutes and address what the other members of the panel had said. Mr. Sussman.
Okay, 2 minutes is very tough here. But let me make a couple of points here. Let me start with the legal issues. There were 3 of them that were identified. The first is that EPA can't promulgate a 111D rule for existing sources unless there is a 111B rule in place for new and modified sources, and that's absolutely true. EPA does have a 111B proposal, which it has not yet finalized. We don't know how EPA is going to finalize that rule, and what ultimately it will say is the best system of emission reduction. It may be carbon capture and sequestration. It may be something else. We just don't know. And so I don't think we could assume at this point in time either that EPA won't promulgate a 111B rule or that it will promulgate a 111B rule that is legally infirm. On the subject of carbon capture and sequestration, there are commercial scale CCS projects. There is, in fact, one in Canada that is now operating today. There is another project in Mississippi that is on the cusp of operation. So there is evidence that this is indeed a feasible technology and one which can be applied at a commercial scale. The DC Circuit case law makes it clear that 111B is intended to be technology forcing, and that a technology which is over the horizon, but nonetheless seems to be viable technically and economically, can be a basis for a new source performance standard, even if that technology is not, in fact, in use today. Let me touch on the best system of emission reduction. I think this is an issue where the plain language of the statute is going to work in EPA's favor, and where, frankly, EPA will be entitled to some discretion because 111D has not been widely applied or widely construed. And I think it's hard to get around the point that a system of emission reduction is different by its plain meaning from an emission control technology that is employed by a plant. Now, of course, BSER has to be applicable to the source under the plain terms of the statute. But what does that mean? I think what it means is that there should be some reason to believe that the source, i.e. The utility operating the source, can meet the obligations that are being applied either by making changes in the plant itself or by making other changes in its operations that enable it to meet the emission reduction target. So I think EPA is going to be in very good shape there. I want to respond briefly to...
I think it's time to pass on to Mr. Bailey.
Okay. Maybe later.
Sure. Let me try this in a set of bullets here rather than making a coherent speech. Since I'm not an attorney, I will therefore make comments about the legal arguments, of course. As I understand the situation, there are at least three sets of legal issues we have. The court eventually will have before. One is the threshold issue, which has been addressed here, which is, can EPA regulate under 111D sources that are regulated under 112? The second issue is whether EPA can set standards based on measures outside the fence. We could spend a whole day talking about the consequences of EPA ultimately itself having to regulate sources outside the fence of a power plant, requiring states to reduce the use of electricity and increase renewables, which are not stationary sources under the Clean Air Act. That would be a whole day. The third category of issues of whether EPA has been arbitrary and capricious in all the math it's used to set the emission rates. Why states are different from other states, but they have to meet the same renewable requirements and the same energy efficiency requirements. So there are a lot of other legal issues here that these gentlemen are much more expert about commenting on than I am. 111B has come up here. 111B requires new coal-fired power plants, if they're economic in the future, and right now they are not, to install carbon capture and storage, a technology which we do not believe, and a lot of others do not believe, has been adequately demonstrated. One of the tests that EPA used to justify carbon capture and storage for a new coal-fired power plant is that the technology is not exorbitantly costly, and I'm quoting. A new coal-fired power plant costs about $2 billion if one were to build one today. Carbon capture and storage costs $1 billion for that plant. So we're increasing the cost of a plant about 50%. EPA has concluded that that is not an exorbitant cost. The last comment I'll make is that the facility in Mississippi is right now, I think it's somewhere above $6 billion, when the plant could probably have cost a fraction of that. And that has a lot to do with carbon capture and storage technology, which EPA believes is inexpensive enough to require on a new coal-fired power plant. Judge, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Professor Percival.
Bob Sussman's already done a good enough job with some of these, so I'm just going to refer to a couple things. One was the argument that it can't be the best demonstrated if it's based on a government-sponsored project like the initial carbon capture and storage project that's going on now. That was brought up in the Nebraska case that was dismissed, but the way in which EPA interprets that is meaning it can't be based solely on a government-sponsored project, and so that was one reason why the court didn't find it compelling, the notion that we should halt the rulemaking before the rule's already been adopted. Secondly, the question about how you reconcile the House and Senate versions that both ended up in the Clean Air Act. The differences between, do you say that if any air pollutant is regulated as a hazardous air pollutant, that air pollutant can't be regulated under Section 111D? That makes sense, because you don't want to have conflicting technology-based regulations are required by Section 112 on that air pollutant. But it doesn't make any sense to say if a particular source category happens to have one pollutant that's regulated as a hazardous air pollutant, that there's absolutely nothing you can do to regulate it under Section 111D. I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Lynn?
Thank you. Paul basically covered the issues on 111B, and I was going to talk about the Kemper plant, and he's already that $6 billion plant. The issue in Nebraska, which I'll just mention very briefly, I mean, it was dismissed on a threshold ground because the rule's not final yet. I didn't really read that as the court weighing in on the merits, so we'll have our chance then when it is final. As to whether the restriction on source categories versus air pollutants in sort of 111D versus 112 makes sense, I mean, here's one thing to remember. In the 1990 amendments, not only did Congress make the amendment that we think is the law, which is changing it from essentially you can't double regulate a hazardous air pollutant, as opposed to you can't double regulate a source category. What they also included in those amendments was provision 112N1D, I think, and that gave EPA the option to decide whether they were going to regulate power plants under 112 at all. They've made that determination. They've implemented a rule there. It's the Mercury rule, which is now on a cert petition to the Supreme Court. And it's, if I remember correctly, and Paul can correct me later, but I think it's a $9 billion cost rule. It came out of the DC Circuit, 2-1 decision with Kavanaugh in dissent. So they've made that decision under N1D. And what we think is perfectly logical is that Congress said, you can't, if you decide to do hazardous air pollutants under 112, you can't double regulate under 111D. The last thing I would say on the best system of emissions reduction, again, I think there's a lot of language which talks about applying the system to a particular source. I think you can't regulate outside the fence. The one thing that I will say, I'm just going to read something from the court's UARG decision. Now, the 4 building blocks that the judge talked about are important because, the EPA is talking about a regulation that will affect coal-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, gas power plants, and then the demand side, the consumer side, the air conditioners and the refrigerators. That's the entire energy sector. And what Scalia said in his opinion is, EPA's interpretation, this is a totally different provision, I'll concede that, but this is what he says. EPA's interpretation is also unreasonable because it would bring about an enormous and transformative expansion in EPA's regulatory authority without clear congressional authorization. Skip a sentence, and he says, we expect Congress to speak clearly if it wishes to assign to an agency decisions of vast economic and political significance. And so I would just keep that in mind as you follow this issue through the next year or two and as it goes up to the Supreme Court. Thanks.
We have time left for questions, but I will exercise the chair's prerogative to ask the first question. There's been a lot of talk among members of the panel about the difference between Section 111B and Section 12 and the multiple versions of Section 111B. But as an outsider here, when I read the EPA's proposal, one of the first things that struck me was, where is authority being allocated? The EPA wants states to do something in this list of 4 possibilities: more efficiency, change the dispatch table, have power generated in cleaner ways, wind or nuclear, and have more energy efficiency at home or in industry. But neither the EPA nor the states is fully in charge of the last 3 on that list. The dispatch table is largely the work of the regional transmission organizations. They're multi-state organizations that hook up the power grid. Those organizations not only are multi-state and beyond the scope of most state regulatory authority, but they're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, not by the EPA. The FERC has a great deal of authority over wind plants. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is in charge of nuclear plants, and so on. The question I have for members of the panel is, how does one get a coherent energy policy out of this combination? And it seems to me very difficult to say, well, we'll just ask the states to do it, when part of the difficulty is the division of authority. I've already named 3 federal regulatory agencies. One has to get all of those in line, or it's very difficult to have a coherent policy. Members of the panel have any views about that?
Let me answer that. I think it's important to be precise about what the relevant EPA building block, which is building block 2, says. It does not mention dispatch. It says that utilization of gas plants will increase and utilization of coal plants will decrease. Now, certainly one technique for doing that is changing the order of dispatch, but there are many other techniques for doing that. A cap-and-trade system might do that. Some sort of a surcharge on electricity based on its carbon content might do that. So I think that the states have the capability to implement this building block based on the authority that they have under the Clean Air Act and the authority that they have under their own state programs.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Sorry, do it, Lord. I just want to point out, the rule also encourages states to work together on a regional basis with one another and give states who do so more time to develop the state plans.
Just one thing. When you start peeling this onion, you get beyond the soothing words of flexibility and things like that. This is the issue that states are wrestling with right now. I spent time with officials in at least 13 states so far, and they're wrestling with this very issue right now. We know who submits the plan. We're not sure who is legally accountable for what goes wrong if the plan goes wrong. You know, how the Public Service Commission works with the DEQ, works with all these others, and these states have 1 year to figure all that out once the rule goes final. Second of all, most obviously, Public Service Commissions do not regulate co-ops and municipal power authorities in states. That's another layer of this onion.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to the floor, and we are open to questions from the floor. That means something different from a speech, right? They should be short and pointed and pose a problem for the panel. I'd like you to identify yourself and then pose your question.
Judge, could you, I have a little bit of a hearing problem. Could you perhaps repeat the question?
I will be happy to repeat the question if I manage to hear it.
Okay.
And you'll have to excuse me if I can't identify who's asking these questions, even if I know you. There are 2 very bright lights staring me in the eye. All I can see out there is a line of shadows behind the microphone. Please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Bob Evnan, pleasure to be here. It's great to hear this really outstanding panel. Professor Percival, I have a couple of questions for you regarding your
You only get to ask one.
Well, I have one two-part question for you. With respect to your criticism of Mr. Bailey's numbers and costs. One is that you noted that per capita greenhouse gas emissions in the United States is far greater than that in China. And the question related to that is, what difference does that make if we are concerned about aggregate greenhouse gas emissions and its effect on the globe? And the second is your observation that we have to do something, and whatever it is, whatever the cost is of what we have to do in order to get China to do something or anything, we ought to do. My question with respect to that is there any outside limit to the cost that the United States should pay in order to get very small marginal improvements in greenhouse gas emissions?
Okay. Thanks for the two-part question. What difference does it make that our emissions on a per capita basis are higher than China? It makes it harder to persuade the Chinese to act because they can say, look, you guys caused most of the problem. It's true we're the #1 emitter in absolute terms today. You're still emitting more than twice as much on a per capita basis as we are. It's because we're a big country that we're emitting so much. And that's why President Obama's agreement with Xi Jinping is so historic, that we finally have gotten them to commit themselves. With respect to the second part, I don't think I ever said whatever the cost, we have to try to persuade the Chinese. In fact, just in 2009, after the Obama administration took over, the State Department sent me on a lecture tour of China to talk up the importance of China agreeing to limit its emissions prior to the Copenhagen conference. I gave 17 lectures in all 6 consular regions of China, and I got nothing but pushback from the Chinese. At the Dalian Academy of Sciences, a professor stood up after my talk and said, global warming's not real. If it's real, it's not caused by humans. If it's real and caused by humans, China's already doing enough. But 1 year later, I was invited back to a conference where the Chinese were debating, should we enact a new climate change law or use our existing clean air legislation to deal with the problem? There had been a complete sea change in Chinese thinking about it, and I think it's attributable to 2 factors. First, they were very sensitive to the criticism they got at Copenhagen for not being willing to agree to cap their emissions. And secondly, they now realize this is an economic opportunity. They have a lot of advanced solar, wind technology. They have their own version of electric cars, although I think my Tesla is far superior to them. And Tesla's now opened up a showroom in Beijing, and they're selling like crazy in China as well. But they actually are further along than we are in doing cap and trade. EPA can't propose cap and trade under the existing Clean Air Act, but if states want to adopt regional systems, they're encouraged to do so by this rule. So this rule is really crucial to our ability to keep the Chinese, who have now gotten religion about the need to control their emissions, on that path.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking with us today. John Peterson, Harvard Federalist Society. Professor Percival, this is to you, but anyone on the panel, feel free to comment. You alluded in your talk that the initial decision to use the CAA to regulate climate change was at least partially due to a lack of political will and ability to pass more comprehensive legislation tailored to the problem. Do you believe this might have had kind of a detrimental effect in kind of poisoning the consensus for passing something more specifically tailored to the problem and actually kind of set the mission back in using an older statute to address it?
Well, actually, at the time, the Obama administration had taken the position, if we don't get legislation, we'll use the existing Clean Air Act as our way of dealing with climate change. We used to live in a world where there was overwhelming bipartisan consensus in favor of having environmental statutes that created comprehensive national regulatory programs. That's how we got the original Clean Air Act regulatory program in 1970 and the far-reaching 1990 amendments that President George H.W. Bush heralded and shepherded in. Now we're in a situation where there's complete legislative gridlock in Congress on environmental legislation, so that's why you see all these issues being fought out in the courts about how to interpret those old statutes. One difference here between the situation in UARC, where EPA was trying to use the PSD program to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, was that there...
Professor Percival, for some people in the audience, PSD may
Oh,
not
sorry.
be understandable. It's prevention of significant deterioration. That's another one of the acronyms in the EPA's list of 71 acronyms in this regulation.
Yeah, there, EPA had to admit that if you took the statute literally, it wouldn't make sense to regulate all these small sources, and that in part contributed to the Supreme Court saying you can't do it in exactly the way EPA wanted to do it, while upholding about 97% of the sources that EPA want to regulate. So we are in a situation where the absence of consensus in Congress, but I think there'll be a lot of consensus in Congress starting in January, but there'll be fights between Congress and the president, and in those situations, you just have these issues fought out in the courts.
Thank you. Ken Davis, Richmond, Virginia. Question about the agency's estimate of benefits and costs. Judge Easterbrook gave one of the ranges in the ratio for the ratio that I've heard. I'd like to ask any member on the panel, if you look at the numerator and strip out unrelated secondary ancillary benefits, as well as non-U.S. climate benefits, what's the number that results if you're just looking at the agency's estimate of U.S. climate benefits over compliance costs? Wouldn't that kind of ratio line up better, given the narrow definition of climate?
Okay.
Of compliance
The question
costs?
is, what is the agency's own estimate of U.S. climate benefits? In my opening, I pointed out that their estimate of all benefits is about 1/3 climate and 2/3 other. So how much in the U.S.? Mr. Bailey.
If I understand your question, I'm going to use some jargon here, but if I understand your question, it is what would the benefits be, first of all, if we took out the alleged benefits from reducing coal emissions, is that right? Co-benefits? Right. Okay. So if you take those out, and we think those are not legitimately claimed as benefits of the rule, but Bob and I and others will probably talk about that. The administration looks to what is called the social cost of carbon, which is a way of quantifying the benefits of reducing carbon emissions. That is also controversial. The administration was told in 2010, and they ignored it in 2013, to just use the social cost of carbon or the benefits from reducing carbon domestically. So once you sort of sort through all that, the benefits of reducing carbon, if you believe all the math here, could be as low as $1 per ton. Could be as high as $29 per ton. So you simply multiply that by what this rule reduces, which is about 500 million tons a year. You have benefits of about $500 million a year, and then you have costs of $41 billion a year. That's really what this comes down to.
Let me add to that. First of all, the $41 billion a year is Paul's number and the number of his association, and not the EPA number, which, as Judge Easterbrook said, is $5 billion a year. Secondly, I think that it's dicey to separate U.S. carbon benefits from global carbon benefits, because, in fact, emission reductions in other countries benefit the U.S., and therefore, if you assume, for example, as is the case, that the European Union, in parallel with the United States, is making reductions of a magnitude equal to, if not greater than, U.S. reductions, those reductions are having substantial benefits over here. So it really makes sense not to have a narrow U.S. perspective on that issue. Secondly, I want to emphasize that any estimate of climate benefits as a function of tons reduced is going to have a degree of uncertainty to it, and yet we know that the consequences of climate change over time are calamitous and enormously costly to society. So I think the question we really need to be asking is whether the level of cost we're talking about is warranted as an insurance policy against impacts which could be extraordinarily disruptive. I would submit that at the level of $5 billion a year, we are not even getting close to the level of cost that should make us be concerned about the sustainability of our economy.
Mr. Lynn, Professor Percival? Okay, next please.
My question is whether this is really about reducing the rise of sea levels by 1/100 of an inch, or whether it's more part of a concerted effort to get us to reduce our energy consumption. A couple of data points I'd like the panel to consider in answering. What power source does the EPA want us to go to? Where I live in Washington State, by the way, I'm Kai Alberg, Port Angeles, Washington, sorry. We are the first county where power dams are being taken out by the federal government. There are other robust efforts in other western states because they're bad for the fish.
What is the question?
Nuclear power plants are hard. What other power sources does the EPA want us to go to? Natural gas, you have fracking, you have methane production. Do we have to reduce power consumption, or is there a regulatorily favored alternative power source to coal?
I think we have the question. Number 3 in the EPA's list of things to do, for the states to do, is to move to other sources of generation, whether they be wind or water or tide or biorenewable materials or nuclear. The question is how, I take it that the question is how practical are those suggestions?
Well, I think that they're very practical because they're happening today. We've seen a remarkable scale up of wind power and solar power over the last 10 years. There are parts of the country where 10% of the power mix is coming from wind alone. The cost of those technologies have come down significantly. Rooftop solar is proliferating rapidly in many parts of the country and is cost competitive with fossil fuels. So I think we have a burgeoning market for renewables, and it's only going to get bigger. We also have the ability to use more natural gas than we are using today. It's plentiful, it's low cost, it's lower emitting, it's more than proved its value in the marketplace as compared to coal. We could use more of it than we're doing today.
Just to do the China angle, China has a national renewable portfolio standard that said they were going to get 15% of their energy from renewables by 2020. As a result of the agreement with President Obama, they're actually going to up that to 20%. They're in a very similar situation. They have lots of dirty coal resources that they now are starting to limit the exploitation of and moving away from coal towards renewable energy.
I would say one of the interesting things to think about, though, is, with these 4 building blocks, not all of them are equally feasible for all of the states. In West Virginia, we're almost exclusively coal-fired power plants. And so when the suggestion is, that there are a number of different ways to get to our numbers of 20% reduction, how are we going to go to nuclear when we don't have any nuclear facilities? That's part of the thing that our DEP, our Department of Environmental Protection, is struggling with. And one of the things I would add, this is a little bit off topic, I didn't get a chance to respond to Judge Easterbrook's question before, is an interesting wrinkle on the difficulty for states is it does say we have to submit a plan, but if we don't submit a plan, then it goes back to EPA, and they then get to submit a plan, and there's some question whether maybe it makes sense to just put this back in the federal government's lap and see if they can figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Julie Blake, Charleston, West Virginia. One way to evaluate whether the EPA's new rules go too far is to look at them from a lens of justice and social justice, and particularly their effect on the poor and poverty, either in terms of expanding access to affordable energy or whether the economic changes caused by these rules will be a generator of communities entering cycles of poverty from which they can't leave. Obviously something that's of huge concern to West Virginia. And I was just wondering if the panel could address their thoughts on this aspect of the power plants rules and say whether they think the impact on poverty will be something justified or profoundly important to the country and something that should be a greater part of the conversation.
Okay, everybody get the question?
Sure.
Oh, the question is, what is the relation between these rules and social justice, including income distribution and poverty? And is that effect, whatever it is, justified?
Sure, let me try this. The median household income in this country is about $50,000 before taxes. I want you to think about that. The median household income, $50,000 before taxes. Any increase in energy prices, whether it's gasoline, electricity caused by EPA rules, is regressive on lower incomes. Those on Social Security, those at other lower income levels. Over the past decade or so, real family income has declined by more than 20%. Energy prices have increased by more than 20%. So we see this as, in those terms, as costs being regressive on lower income households. That's the way we view this right now. So we're talking about electricity price increases. I think West Virginia, we were projecting something like 13% on average per year, and you know what the situation is in West Virginia better than I do.
Others?
I would just say that again, those are Paul's numbers.
These are U.S. Census data.
Well, what I'm going to say, Paul, is that EPA's analysis is that electricity outlays by consumers will go down under this rule. Now, we could have a debate about whether that's true or not, but I think we need to keep in mind that there are two very different perspectives on that issue, and there are studies that have been done on both sides, and we need to look at those studies and decide where the weight of opinion really lies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we can move in two more questions if we are reasonably brief in both questions and answers.
Talking fast. From President Nixon's announcement of the EPA executive order and the Clean Air Act language making states central to implementation of regulation, also Supreme Court saying states take the first cut, how does this rule, in the words of General Pruitt from Oklahoma, not transfer so much authority from the states to the federal government that states then exist as satellite offices of the federal government?
Well, I think it's exactly the opposite, because what EPA is doing here is saying we're giving the states maximum flexibility. They can develop their plans tailored to their own situation, and as long as they meet the emissions reduction target, those plans will be acceptable.
Other thoughts? Thank you very much. Our final question for the panel.
Alden Abbott, McLean, Virginia. France relies on nuclear power for 85% of its power, and yet regulatory constraints in the U.S. have basically destroyed the U.S. nuclear power industry. Does anyone want to comment about regulation in general that might reduce the constraints on the future of a nuclear power industry in the U.S.?
I would suggest it wasn't specifically regulatory constraints, but 3 Mile Island that really put a pause on the nuclear industry. We now do have the first new nuclear plants under construction since essentially the 3 Mile Island accident, and I think the Obama administration has taken kind of an even-handed approach to nuclear power, and you know, environmentalists now, James Hansen, the famous climate scientist, saying that environmental groups should endorse nuclear power because it has no greenhouse gas emissions. The problem largely has been the cost of building these plants, and that's why the new plants that are under construction are being heavily subsidized by the federal government.
Other thoughts about this? I mean, if I recall correctly, when the president came to office, he said quite favorable things about nuclear energy, which not only has no carbon dioxide emissions, it has no sulfur dioxide emissions, hugely costly, and no particulate emissions. But not all that much has happened. Is that because of some lingering regulations? It seems very hard to believe it's a result still of 3 Mile Island. Not only has there been no repeat of that in the United States, but the costs of 3 Mile Island are so tiny compared to the costs of sulfur dioxide that one wonders whether that can still be causal.
Nuclear power is under a lot of economic pressure in this country right now, which I think is unrelated to environmental regulation and frankly has a lot to do with the competitiveness of using nuclear power for base load electricity generation as compared to natural gas. And the result of that is that nuclear plants have been closed and other nuclear plants are in trouble. My personal view is that we need nuclear power to achieve our climate goals. It would be a catastrophe if the 20% of U.S. electricity that is now generated by nuclear plants were to disappear because those plants closed. And so I do think we need to find a way to keep nuclear energy in the mix. I think EPA would like to do that under this rule. Unfortunately, their initial attempt to do that was very misdirected, and so they need to go back to the drawing board.
I just want to add, I think we probably would have seen a resurgence of nuclear power in the U.S. except for the horribly timed Fukushima Daiichi accident.
Thank you very much to our audience and especially to our panel. Hope to see you at later panels today.